Let me move on to another piece of work that you are kind of closely associated with, which is the Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana. Right? That was the first successful large-scale implementation of health insurance in the country. It subsequently informed, in some sense, the design of Ayushman Bharat also, which is one of the flagship programs of the current Prime Minister. Firstly, I was looking at your postings and you were never in the health ministry, right? From what I know, you were never really in the health ministry, but still you were anchoring the Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana. So I'm a little intrigued, how did that happen? And what was the design of it? I know that it was a massive scale, but what was the scale, what was the design of RSBY?
It has a very interesting background actually. I was in labor, as it were, in the Ministry of Labor and going through painful existence without delivering anything. And suddenly the Prime Minister announced a health insurance scheme for the poorest of the poor. And as was the wont at that point in time, after every such announcement, there was a group of ministers set up. And this group of ministers was chaired by Mr. Chidambaram. And in the first meeting, my minister was supposed to go there. He couldn't go. The secretary couldn't go. So I was deputizing for them. I had no clue as to what's going to happen in the meeting. But since my minister was a part of a group of ministers, so I was there, sitting there. In one corner, in government, you sit by hierarchy. So I was probably the junior most officer sitting there in one corner. And the meeting started, so Mr. Chidambaram turned towards the health secretary and asked him that the Prime Minister has announced this health insurance program. Why don't you come up with a paper in the next meeting with the details and we'll discuss that. So the health secretary tried to wriggle out. He said, sir, we are already busy with National Rural Health Mission and sir, health insurance is not doing anywhere well in the world. So if you could spare us. So for some, which I later on conjecture that it would have been political, health ministry was spared of that scheme. He turned towards his right, towards the head of the organization of banking and insurance and asked him that it's insurance scheme, so you do it. He said, sir, well, we are already saddled with a universal health insurance scheme and it's going nowhere, we're finding it very difficult. Now, the meeting came to a standstill because both the primary ministries
were not willing to
washed their hands off because they knew how complex it was. Suddenly, somebody whispered something in the ears of Mr. Chidambaram, who was sitting next to him. And I heard my name announced. Who is Anil Swarup? So I stood up with my folded hands, sir, I am Anil Swarup. You will do this scheme. I said, sir, but I am already in labor, I am already in pain. What do you mean already in pain? This is a scheme. I said, sir, but this is a health insurance scheme. No, this scheme is for workers. And you are Director General Labour Welfare, so it's welfare of workers. So I told him, sir, by that logic, all schemes of the government should come to me because every scheme is for some worker. This is what you're joking. No, you'll have to do it. So I came out of the room like a zombie. What had hit me. So I went and asked my wife, do you know anything about health insurance? He said, मुझे क्या पता? No, but चिंता नहीं करो, कुछ ना कुछ हो जाएगा. That was the beginning of health insurance. Remember, again, God has been very kind to me during my career. I found people in the World Bank, in ILO, who helped me get expertise. And then this scheme evolved. Now, we had three fundamental aspects to look into it. I was convinced that if you are going to make a scheme for anybody, I have to look at the consumer, the ultimate beneficiary, and then design the scheme. Not the other way around. Sitting in Delhi, have that wisdom and work out as you know. So we looked at the target group, and the target group was that this person who was poor, since he was poor, he could not make payments upfront to the hospital and claim it from the insurance company. So the insurance scheme had to be cashless. This was not difficult because there were cashless health insurance schemes. The second one was that he was illiterate. Most of the, below poverty line are illiterate. Now, insurance documents are long, tiny. I mean, none of us reads those documents. So the insurance scheme had to be paperless. Now, this was very difficult. Because nowhere in the world was there a paperless health insurance scheme. Nowhere. So we had to evolve a paperless. And even more difficult was the third part. Most of these workers migrated from one place to the other temporarily or permanently to seek benefit. Now there was no scheme in the country where the benefits were portable, meaning thereby, whether it is PDS or MNREGA, you could get benefit in the district you are, but once you traveled outside, at that point in time, you could not get the benefit. So how to make them portable? So there we use technology to bring in a paperless scheme, cashless
portable.
And portable scheme. I think that was the hallmark of that scheme. And as I rightly said, though this scheme was in a limbo for a few years when the new government came, after 3 years or so, and I distinctly remember that time when I got a call from Prime Minister's office asking me to come over and explain health insurance to the Prime Minister. So I told the PMO that
Current Prime Minister.
Yeah. I told the PMO that I'm an education secretary. What is my lowest and I? He said, no, you come over and try and explain if he asks you. So I said, how can I come? Then I was told that there is a review of health ministry and they will also have a review of education ministry. So you'll be present. In case the Prime Minister asks you, we explain. So I went there in the meeting in the evening. The health secretary made a presentation. Prime Minister didn't look convinced. The idea was exactly the same which I had, which is insurance model. And somehow the Prime Minister was not very convinced about the insurance part of it. So then he turned towards me, Anil ji, aapko kya raay hai iske bare mein? Aap rahe hain insurance mein. So I started, and this is 3 months before my retirement. So I explained to him in 15 minutes, I spoke him, saying, ek tak mujhe sunte rahe. At the end of it, he says, Anil ji, aap theek keh rahe hain. That day, Ayushman Bharat was born. And the interesting feature was, I was coming out, Joint Secretary to PMO, he said, sir, आपको तो पता था कि PM साहब नाराज हो जाते हैं इंश्योरेंस मॉडल में, फिर भी आपने वो बात कह दी. हमने कहा देखो यार, मुझे ना उनसे आज कुछ लेना है ना रिटायरमेंट के बाद कुछ लेना है. जो मैंने ठीक समझा उनको बता दिया, अगर वो अच्छा लगता ठीक था, नहीं लगता तो उनका. बट I gave him the advice that I thought was the best.
Yeah. What was the scale of RSBY? Just to put that in.
We covered at that point in time 350 million people. Almost a third of India's population at that point.
That's massive. So would you say this has been one of the most satisfying impact that you've had in your entire career?
Undoubtedly. It was an amazing sense of satisfaction. And that is the time when I thought there can't be a better service than the IS. Because, people do very good things. It's not that others are not doing. But the impact that you can create is absolutely amazing.
An impact at scale.
And some of the personal experiences that I had were absolutely phenomenal. I still get goosebumps recounting. This scheme came to be recognized world over as one of the finest schemes. I remember I get a call from one of the advisors of Obama who had just taken over as president.
And healthcare was
there was trouble there. So he said, Mr. Swarup, can you come over to Washington and make a presentation on your health insurance scheme? I said, I have nothing to offer. This is a different context. I wanted to wriggle out. No, but if you come to Washington, it would be great if you can make a presentation. So it's one of my visits to Washington. I used to interact with World Bank. I went over to Brookings Institute where I made a presentation on this health insurance scheme where, representatives of the federal government, the state government, our own mission people, as well as representatives of Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, they were sitting there. So I made a presentation. So I came out of the room after the presentation. We are having a cup of coffee. This gentleman from Gates Foundation walks up to me and asks me, Mr. Swarup, you seem to be very passionate about this scheme. What does the government give you beyond your salary? A very interesting question. What does the government give you? So I paused for a while. And then I asked him a counter question. I asked him, Gates Foundation gives millions of dollars to poor countries. What do you get out of it? He said, well, that's a job. But more than that, we derive a lot of satisfaction out of helping the poor. I said, you answered your own question. This RSBY, the Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, is meant for the poorest of the poor, many of whom would have been dead but for this scheme. So the good wishes of those that survived and their families come back to me somehow, anyhow. That's good enough a kick for me to do what I'm doing. I use the word kick here. And then to illustrate the point, I narrated an incident to him. I told him I used to visit, these small hospitals that are empaneled in RSBY. And in one of the visits to these hospitals, I was talking to a beneficiary patient when I heard a very feeble voice from behind. Beta idhar aao. So I was narrating to him in English, but I will narrate here in Hindi because that's how the conversation happened. Beta idhar aao. So I turned around and saw a very old lady. She couldn't sit. She was just flashing the smart card and calling me Beta idhar aao. So I went to her, I bent down and I asked her, Mata ji, aap theek to hain? She told me, Beta, main bahut takleef mein hu, lekin in hospital walon ne mera bada khayal rakha. So I told her, फिर तो माता जी आप ठीक हो जाएंगी, आप अपने घर जाएंगी. नहीं बेटा, मेरी तो उम्र इतनी हो गई, अब मैं ऊपर वाले के पास जाऊंगी. ऐसे नहीं माता जी, आप बिल्कुल घर जाएं. नहीं, मेरा तो ना कोई बेटा है ना भाई, मेरा कोई नहीं है इस दुनिया में. मैं तो भीख मांगती थी. मैं बीमार पड़ गई तो मेरा पड़ोसी था, वो भी भीख मांगता था. उसने तुम्हारा ये कार्ड देखा और मुझे अस्पताल में ले आया. यहाँ ये सब मेरी सेवा कर रहे हैं और मुझसे पैसा भी नहीं मांगते. ऐसा, हाँ माता जी, ये बहुत अच्छा, आपको यहाँ कोई पैसा देने की जरूरत नहीं, आप ठीक होकर जाएंगी. नहीं बेटा, मैं ऊपर वाले के पास जाऊंगी. This carried on for 15 seconds and then she made a remarkable statement. She says, ऊपर वाले जाके एक बार जरूर कहूँगी, तुम्हारी स्कीम बहुत अच्छी है. You know, when I narrate such incident, even now I get goosebumps. So I call them my Bharat Ratnas in my.
Nothing can be more satisfying than really hearing from the people who are benefiting from it, and you know that there's so many of them.